China's and Russia's presidents, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, stood side by side last week, declaring the strength of their partnership while condemning what they called a destructive and hostile United States. The world leaders took aim at the U.S.'s military ties. Xi and Putin called the U.S. a security threat that still thinks about the world in terms of the Cold War. They twisted the purpose of an alliance like NATO, created to protect Western democracy, into a powerful aggressor controlled by one nation. An anti-Western democratic agenda is a key part of China and Russia's disinformation battle with the United States. In a new article in The Atlantic, Applebaum writes about the formula that modern autocrats sell to their citizens and to foreigners, all with the aim of destroying what they call American hegemony. And Anne joins me now for more. Anne, you've written about this for years, the way in which autocrats make common cause in a kind of autocrats club. What is the larger agenda? Is there a collusion, or do they just have common purpose?
So it's important to understand that these are countries that don't necessarily have anything in common ideologically. So Russia, China, Iran, nationalist, communist, theocratic, they don't have a common positive agenda, but they do have a common negative agenda. And that is that they want to push back against the democracy activists inside their own country, who are often the most important challenge to their own power, and to the sources of the democracy language that they hear coming from around the world, whether it's the United States or Europe or democracies in Asia and elsewhere. So, their common cause is that they oppose us. And they see us as a threat to their form of personal power, to the financial regimes that they've established in their countries, and to the stability of their own relationships.
And so this is where would you, or how would you define this relative to what people might recognize in their history books as the Cold War fight between capitalism and communism, which was also a question of values and an ideological struggle that also played obviously out in economic and military forms? How would this be compared to that?
So I think it's quite different, actually. I would not call this a new Cold War. There's no geographical divide. There's no Berlin Wall. It's not like there's good guys on one side and bad guys on the other. In fact, there are people inside many democracies who collude with autocratic powers, or who seek to evade the law, money laundering laws or company laws. There are, and at the same time, there are democratic activists inside the autocratic world as well. There are also a lot of countries in between who are sometimes interested in being on one side and sometimes on the other. So it's not like there's a black and white line. Instead, there is a kind of conflict of ideas, but the conflict and the battle takes place inside most countries. It's not merely between one group on one side and one group on the other side.
Help us understand the different tactics of propaganda used in this by these U.S. adversaries.
So essentially, the authoritarians share, as I said, they're different in many ways, but they do share a few common narratives. In essence, they want to portray their political systems as stable, calm, powerful, and they want to portray our system as divided, chaotic, degenerate, declining. And they do this in various ways. They do it the Russians do it by speaking about traditional values, which most Russians, of course, aren't that interested in, but they use it as a way of showing, we have traditional values. We don't believe in gay marriage. The Chinese talk about their tradition of economic success. They have ways of speaking about the success and calm and peace of autocracy, of course, ignoring their own opposition and their own internal dissent. And as I said, but most of their effort is focused on undermining our system. And that's, of course, the piece of their narrative that has been so easily picked up by people inside our system, inside the United States, inside European countries, because the narrative of division, chaos, decline, and degeneracy is one that also appeals to some people in the United States or some people in European countries, and they also see our system as declining, and they respond well to the autocratic attempts to amplify those kinds of narratives. And that's really where you see their success. So when Russia messages into the United States. It's not that Russia is creating necessarily something new. They're amplifying the people who are saying more or less the same thing in our country. And briefly at the end, Anne, on that very point, in the old days, what would have happened if that kind of message had come into the United States about the simplicity of order and strength? Is it not just an affection for these ideas finding root in the United States, but is there a lack of pushback or a lack of what previously would have been a force to work against these ideas? Well, we don't really have a strategy to deal with it. We don't have a way of talking about it. There isn't a U.S. government counter narrative as there would have been in the Cold War era. And not everybody in the United States is convinced that we need to push back against these ideas. You know, there are advocates of them who agree with them or who want to see them spread and multiplied. So, I also don't think that we have, as a country, yet an awareness of this network, how it operates, both in the area of propaganda and in the area of kleptocracy and also in the area of foreign policy and diplomacy. And we haven't really got a strategy yet to confront it, to unify our own alliances and to push back. Anne Applebaum, staff writer for The Atlantic. Thanks so much, Anne. Thank you.